All right, let's continue our study of this fascinating Daniel 9 prophecy. So we talked about the trigger that kicks off that 69 weeks of years is that issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Not the temple, that was a different decree, several decrees as a matter of fact, but to rebuild Jerusalem. There were several that dealt with the temple. King Cyrus, for example, in 537 BC, issued that initial decree to rebuild the temple, set in Zerubbabel over there. You can read all about it in Ezra chapter 1. King Cyrus is a fascinating person of history. I encourage you to do some studies about him just from a biographical standpoint. We use him in some of our leadership training, the leadership principles that he espoused. Fascinating historical figure. You can also read about him in Isaiah 44 and 45, where Isaiah was given a prophecy about King Cyrus by name and outlined his biography in advance, probably 100 years or so before he was born. So that's a fascinating study in and of itself. But that's not the decree that's being spoken about here. Now, King Darius also issued a decree. You read about that in Ezra 6, also about the temple. Artaxerxes Longimanus, 458 BC. You can read about it in Ezra 7, dealt with the temple. But there was only one that we have a record of that dealt with the city itself. And that's the decree that's being spoken about here in Daniel 9. And that was the same guy, Artaxerxes Longimanus, in 445 BC, so 12 or 13 years later. And that decree is outlined in Nehemiah chapter 2. So it's worth our while to go take a look at these first 8 verses of Nehemiah chapter 2. And it came about in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. That, of course, is Artaxerxes Longimanus. There were several by that name. That wine was before. Remember, Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king. And I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, though you're not sick?" This is nothing but sadness of the heart. Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate, and its gates have been consumed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What would you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. I kind of get the feeling, that here Nehemiah is. He's going before the king. He's making this appeal, and he just shoots up this quick prayer. Right on the spur of the moment, shoots up this quick prayer to God, and give me strength, give me words, give me wisdom. And that's something for us to understand, that when we're in that moment of crisis, God will give us the words that we need. And I said to the king, "If it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city." See, the emphasis here is on the city, not on the temple. "To the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Rebuild what? Rebuild the city. That's the key. Then the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be? And when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. And I said to the king, "If it please the king, let letters be given me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress, which is by the temple, for the wall of the city, and for the house to which I go." And the king granted them to me, because the good hand of my God was on me. So he has the favor of the Lord, and he's actually getting the building supplies given to him by the king. How crazy is that? So there's enough clues contained in this Nehemiah account that we can actually calculate the exact date by our calendar. It would have been the 2nd of Nisan in the Jewish calendar. We convert it to our calendar, it would be March 14th of the year 445 BC. Now, we've got to give a great deal of credit to Sir Robert Anderson. Sir Robert Anderson was an inspector at Scotland Yard in the 1890s, and he wrote a book called The Coming Prince. It's based on the Daniel 9 prophecy. Remember, the people of the prince who is to come, the coming prince. And he wrote this fascinating book. I really encourage you. Can still get it on Amazon and other places. I would encourage you to get it. It's well worth the read. And Sir Robert Anderson approaches Bible study very much like I do it. We both have a law enforcement background, and we look at it inductively. Let's just follow the evidence and see where the evidence leads us. Let's apply literal hermeneutics when we can, And he made some fascinating comments, by the way, in that book where he did the studies and the numbers and the dates I'm about to show you. But he said things like, for example, can you imagine being in the Old Testament era and you see the Old Testament prophecy about a virgin being with child and giving and bearing a son? You would think, well, that's never happened before. That must be figurative. That must be allegorical. We can't take that literally if you were an Old Testament Jew before Jesus was born. But now, what do we know? We know it was fulfilled literally. So God says what he means and means what he says, and I always like to look at the literal application whenever I can from a hermeneutic standpoint. Sir Robert Anderson went on to say that in his era, he was trying to figure out end times. He says, I can't see from the 1890s how in the world Israel will ever re-enter the land as a nation. Politically, it did not make sense to him. After the diaspora, they've been spread all over the world. How are they ever going to get back into the nation of Israel? He said, but the scripture is very clear before the Messiah can return that Israel must be back in the land. And so he saw that as a key prophecy. But he couldn't figure it out. But he had faith. He said, look, it's just like that virgin birth. I can't see how it would happen, but I know it's going to happen. And look what happens about 50 years later. That's exactly what happened. It took World War II and Hitler and Nazi Germany and all that to bring it all about. But that's what happened in just a few decades after Sir Robert Anderson wrote this book, The Coming Prince. But we're going to give him credit for what I'm about to share with you and trying to figure out these dates. So now we have the trigger, the issuing of the decree. We have the trigger date. We know with a great deal of confidence and precision what date that decree was issued. So now let's look at the target date. That's on the other end, the ending of this 69 weeks of years. So the target, according to Daniel 9, is Messiah the Prince, or Messiah the King. We have the kickoff is the decree issued to rebuild the city, and it ends with Messiah the King. So Jesus, remember, we know he's Messiah. He avoided efforts to make him king. We see this in John 6. So Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. He knew that his time had not yet come. Then, in Luke 19, we see the account where Jesus actually arranges coming into Jerusalem as Messiah the King by deliberately, on purpose, intentionally fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah 9. So let's take a look at the prophecy of Zechariah 9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and endowed with salvation. That's Jesus. Humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. We have this prophecy. Now we can fast forward now into the New Testament and look at Luke 19. This is one of the accounts of the triumphant entry. And, he told his disciples to go get the donkey. Remember that? So they brought it to Jesus, the donkey, and they threw their coats on the colt and put Jesus on it. As he was going, they were spreading their coats on the road. As soon as he was approaching near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the miracles which they had seen, shouting, get this, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. This is from Zechariah 9. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. But Jesus answered, I tell you, if these become silent, the stones will cry out. So we know this story so well, but many times we don't realize this is such a precise fulfillment of the Zechariah 9 prophecy. And for those of us that aren't particularly literate in Old Testament prophecies and Old Testament references, the Pharisees are there to decipher it for us. Thankfully, right? So they know what's going on. They see how important this is, and in their mind, they knew that Jesus is now proclaiming himself to be the Messiah by fulfilling this prophecy, and he's telling them, rebuke your disciples. He said, look, if I tell them to be quiet, the stones are going to cry out. So they understood the significance of what was taking place, the arrival of Messiah the King. And Jesus allowed himself to be proclaimed as the king at that moment that he makes his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. Now, there's enough clues in the gospel accounts that we can calculate that date with a great deal of confidence and precision, and it would have been April 6th, the year 32 AD, according to our calendar. Now that we have all this information, let's see if we can do a little bit of math. Well, we know the decree to rebuild the city was issued in 445 BC. We know that Messiah the King makes his triumphant entry, Jesus does, in 32 AD. If we do the math, if you add up 445 plus 32, you get 477, but you got to remember there's no year zero. So you jump from 1 BC to 1 AD, there's no year zero, so you got to subtract a year out of that. So we got 476 years, our years, between those two years, between those two times. Now, we know that our solar year is approximately 365 days. So if we do the math on that, we come up with 173,740 days between these two events. Well, March 14th, 445 BC is when the decree, we believe, was issued. April 6th, 32 AD is when the triumphant entry occurs. So we got to figure out the difference between those two dates. That's 24 days. You can do the math on that. This is according to our calendar. And then we got to factor in leap years because our solar year is really 365 and a quarter. And as a result of that, we end up with a leap year every 4 years. But it's not exactly that simple. We don't have a leap year every 4 years. It's sort of every 4 years, but not exactly. You see, if a year ends in a double zero, like at the end of a century, the year 2000, for example, the year 1900, 1800, if it ends in a double zero, we don't have a leap year in that year. Did you know that? Look it up. Don't take my word for it. Be a Berean. We don't have a leap year in years ending in a double zero unless those years are also divisible by 400. There's some complicated math that goes into calculating what year is a leap year and what is not a leap year. But if you go and do the math, between these two dates, you find out there's 116 leap years. So we got to add in another 116 days. They would have a February 29th in those years. And then we add up this column, and guess what we get? 173,880 days. The exact number of days that was predicted in Daniel 9. Gabriel's margin of error was 0. He nailed it exactly. Of course he did, with a great precision. Now, watch this. Let's go back and take a closer look at Luke 19, and you're going to see why I included this as part of the blindness of Israel in this study. When he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known in this day, the day he's making his triumphant entry, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. This, I believe, is the blindness of Israel. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you and surround you and hem you in on every side. We saw that in AD 70. They will level you to the ground. Titus did that. Your children within you, they slaughtered the people in Jerusalem, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another. That was literally fulfilled in 70 AD. 30-something years later, because you did not, get this, recognize the time of your visitation. They didn't do the math. There was enough information given to them. They should have been expecting him on that day because of the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9, but apparently did not take it literally and did not do the math to figure out when that day would have arrived and when they could have expected his triumphant entry. So we see the fulfillment of that destruction, AD 70. Legend holds it because the temple was set on fire. There's a debate about who set it on fire, whether it was the Jews or the Romans. But it got set on fire. The gold in the temple melted and ran down in the cracks between the stones, and that's why the Romans took it down stone by stone, was to recover as much of the gold that they could. Jesus made that very prophecy during his Olivet Discourse. We're going to pick this apart in great detail. But Matthew 24, Jesus came out from the temple, was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you see all these things? And truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." Then that was fulfilled in AD 70. It's got some implications that we'll explore later in Revelation chapter 11 about the third temple. If there really and truly is going to be a third temple, where is it going to be? Well, we don't know exactly where the original temple was, believe it or not, because that area has been under Muslim rule for last couple thousand years, for the most of that, 2 millennia. And so we don't know for sure, but we know there are stones on the Temple Mount, one on top of the other. The Wailing Wall is an example of that. So the location of the third temple, if there really is going to be one, I think there will be, may not be on the Temple Mount. Now, we're going to explore that in some detail. It may be, but there's also a decent argument to be made that it won't be there. We'll pick that apart a little bit. We'll look at the various conjectures. There's a northern conjecture and a southern conjecture. We'll look at that when we get to that particular study in Revelation 11, where John is told to go and measure the temple. So our final question about Israel's blindness is this: what were they blinded from? And it tells us right there in the text in Luke 19, the things which make for peace. That's Jesus. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. He's the Messiah. They didn't get it. They weren't expecting him as they should be, and as a result, they were blinded. And it was partial, and it was temporary, and it will continue until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. So we have this unspecified interval between the 69th and the 70th week. We're going to call that the church age. That's the period that we now live, potentially outlined by the 7 letters in the order in which they occur. And we have seen that during this time, the church age, Israel has largely rejected Jesus as its Messiah. As a result, the gospel has been entrusted to the Gentiles. I don't believe that the church has replaced Israel. We've been engrafted in as the wild olive branch into the cultivated olive tree. You can read about that in the book of Romans. And Daniel 9, this prophecy that we're looking at right now, is going to give us a lot more insight into that 70th week, the 7-year period yet to come. That final 7 years before Jesus' return, which is what the rest of the book of Revelation is all about. So starting in our next chapter, chapter 4, we're going to see events, I believe, of that final 7 years begin to unfold and be recorded for us by the Apostle John. So I want to leave you with this thought. We've covered a lot of ground in this study of the church age and Israel's blindness. But look at the level of precision. Gabriel's margin of error was actually 0, 173,880 days in that first 69 weeks. Should we have any doubt that the prophecies of that final 7-year period, that 70th week, will be any less precise? And I'll tell you, no. We don't have any doubts. It's going to be just as precise, and that's the mindset that we're going to use to approach the rest of our study of the book of Revelation as we look at events unfolding before John's eyes as he sees these things in the future in that 70th week of the Daniel 9 prophecy. So join me on the other side as we begin our study of chapter 4, the throne room of God.